Welcome back, everybody. If you're in a small shop like me, you might not have enough room to do your assembly and have a dedicated station for your table saw. Today, I'm going to show you what I did to solve that issue in my shop and give you some tips on what you could do for yours. If that sounds like something you're interested in, stick around. So the shop I'm in is 14 foot wide by 22 foot long. It does have an add-on on the back. I had a separate room for a little stand-up CNC I had in the back there for a while, but now I just kind of cut a hole into that area, give me a little bit extra space. So it does extend back into that area another 7 feet or so. And I've been in here somewhere around 4 years. When I got in here, the floor was all gravel. There was no workbenches or anything. So I kind of started from scratch in here. And even up until this last winter, I'd still been working on a dirt floor, which makes everything very difficult to keep things square and stuff when you're trying to build stuff, especially if it's too big to fit on a surface. But one of the first things I knew I needed to take care of was the fact that the shop was so small, I didn't have an area for the table saw to have its own dedicated area and also a dedicated area to assemble things in. To add on to that, I'm not rich, so I've been working with a contractor saw for quite a few years. I am feeling like I'm about ready to upgrade, but this still is working pretty well for me at the moment. The saw I currently have is a Metabo HPT 10-inch table saw. It does have a removable throat guard. I think most of the contractor saws do now. The reason I bought this one specifically was, one, it was on sale, but it was also the only saw that had a wide enough arbor bolt to accommodate a dado stack. It was the only contractor saw I could find that could accommodate a dado stack. And at the time that I was looking for saws, I couldn't find anything that would accept a dado stack, even in a standalone unit that didn't cost $700 or $800. And I just didn't have that to spend at the time. So I ended up with a contractor saw. So the solution I came up with was to integrate my saw into my assembly table. It does create an issue because you essentially need to make sure that if you're doing a large assembly, that you get all of your materials cut at the table saw before you start assembling, because obviously once you start assembling, your table saw is no longer usable. This still was a better solution for me than having to try and figure out how to get the saw in and out, because remember, I was working on a dirt and gravel floor, so moving tools around in the shop was not really an option for me. So I integrated this right into an assembly bench. The workbench construction is fairly simple. It's made up of 2x4 framing, framed it up just like you would a wall, and then I used 4x4 posts to compose the legs, and I just put some casters on the bottom. Now, before I got the concrete in here, I did just have it shimmed up on the bottom, but since now I have the concrete, I can put the wheels on there and I can actually move the whole assembly table around if I needed to. Don't really have a use to, but I could if I wanted to. The tricky part was fitting the saw into the table. The reason that is because this particular saw has an indentation kind of in the center. It has the same curves as a nice woman. You know what I mean, right? I had to figure out how to get the table saw to sit down in the table and fit my table around it without leaving a bunch of gaps that would allow dust to fall down in. So what I came up with was I built the whole table and put one sheet of plywood on with a rough cut that my saw tabletop could set on. And then I used another sheet of plywood that I custom cut to fit the profile of the saw itself. Now I will give you a disclaimer. I did not actually use the fence that came with this saw, but the previous saws I've had, the included saw fence is about as accurate as next week's forecast. So this provided me a benefit in the fact that I have a full width mounting surface here, and I was able to just simply remove the existing fence off of the table saw and add on this Biesemeyer style fence for about $200. You can buy these, I think, on Amazon. I think this is a Delta. And the only modification I made to this was adding a custom tape to it. I used a fast cap tape on it because it has clearly marked 1/16 of an inch indicators on it. So it makes it really easy to read what your saw fence is at. And because the sight window has an adjustment on it, you can set your fence width once and trust that your width of your cut is accurate. If you get paranoid about that, you can set it once at the beginning of every day or a couple of times a day, but I haven't found that to be necessary. Now, after I'd been using this for a couple years, I decided I was tired of picking up my benchtop router stand and putting that on the workstation to do my routing for long boards. And I decided to go ahead and buy a cheap router plate. This one happens to be a Rockler router plate. It's phenolic. It does get torn up pretty easily, but it does the job. The one downside to this is it's not adjustable, so it's a fixed base. In my case, my router itself, it had a fixed base that had an option to have a crank from the other side. Most of them don't. So if you need to be able to easily adjust your router height from above the table, you're going to want to look for a router lift, whether that's powered or a crank one from the top, where you would just mount your motor in there instead of using the base that comes with your router. And for anybody that's wondering, if you go buy one of these, they do also sell a template. I actually did buy the template for this. I just used double-sided tape to stick it down and used a pattern bit to route it out, pulled the template back off, and then used my pattern bit again to route the rest of it. Now, I know this is messy, but I have been making some modifications to this slowly throughout the years. The most recent update, I built a little shroud around the table saw. The main issue I was having was this table saw was dumping a bunch of dust, even with dust collection, on the bottom shelf here. Now, it does still dump a little, but I built an enclosure. I used plastic sheeting around all of the enclosure, and then I wrapped that plastic sheeting up under the table saw and taped it to the front of my saw. That way I didn't make any modifications to the saw itself. I wanted to leave the saw in a condition to where if I ever decided to sell it one day, I can just put all the pieces back together and it can be used as a normal job site table saw again. Additionally, it became a storage for all of my sleds that I use here on the table saw, and I added some shelving, and there's a little bit more storage on the backside. I'm still kind of getting settled in after the concrete, and I've got a few more benches to build and stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm not sure that I'm ever going to rebuild this until I get a floor standing table saw. And I'm not sure what exactly that looks like yet, but it's at least a few years out for me still. Now, I do apologize. My shop is dirtier than your grandpa's jokes, but I hope you got a little bit of value out of that. Hopefully I gave you an idea, if you're working in a small shop, of what you can do to maybe work around that issue as well. Especially if you were in a situation like I was, where you don't really have the option to move tools around as you need them. It needs to sit somewhere and stay because you don't have the option to roll things around. So if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next one.